The team hospital room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heart monitor. The man stood at the foot of the bed, his broad shoulders slumped, his face lined with years of wear. His eyes stayed fixed on the patient, motionless, yet breathing steadily under the crisp white sheets. The doctor standing beside him broke the silence. We have observed some promising signs, small movements, increased neural activity. Compared to the last years, it's remarkable progress. The man didn't acknowledge the word, his gaze unwavering. Instead, he asked, his voice low and measured. When do you think he'll wake up? The doctor hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I can't say for sure. For the last 6 years, there's been little change, but now it could be soon, maybe a year, 6 months, or even a month. It depends on how his body and mind continue to heal. The man gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. He said nothing more, his silence heavy in the room as he turned his eyes back to the fragile figure on the bed. The Jian household was alive with the joy laughter as they celebrated Isha's 18th birthday. The living room was decorated with the soft fairy lights, balloons, and a large banner that reads, Happy Birthday Isha. Vian stood near the dessert table, keeping a polite smile on her face, determined not to let the tension between her and Jungkook dampen Isha's special day. Isha had sensed that something wasn't right with Vian, as she wasn't fooled to notice that how guarded Vian had become, that her visit to Jian household got limited, and even when she visited Isha, then she always preferred to stay in her room to avoid certain someone. When Isha confronted about this, Vian shrugged, replying that she is taking her advice to maintain a distance between her brother and herself, which Isha could clearly see it was something more than what Vian just said. But then she didn't force her to say something. Vian didn't feel comfortable because she knows that Vian is a person who tells her everything to her. So if she is hiding something, then it will be something she isn't ready to tell her yet. And she respected knowing when she'll feel comfortable, Isha would be the first person Vian would spill everything. While for Vian, her struggle to maintain a decent relationship each and every time, knowing that boundaries should be there because she got too attached to Jeon's, yet can't ignore the love Jeon family offers to her. It's just she always reminds herself that they are not her real family. Jeons were so welcome and loving to her, but she also shouldn't have forgotten that they'll never be her real ones. Thanks for Jungkook to reminding her that. She sticks to her grandma's side most of the time, but then her grandma also got busy talking to Mrs. Jeon, and Isha dragged her to show the gift she had received today. On the other side, Jungkook was finding it harder to focus. His gaze kept drifting towards Vian, who looked as beautiful as ever in her simple yet graceful outfit. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. It was the lingering guilt in his heart. Knowing that Vian had distanced herself from Jeon family, it was clearly visible and he was purely responsible for it. Their talk in her room was like a final statement for him that Vian doesn't want to do anything with him anymore, and she's just bearing him because he's the part of Jeon's. Because every time their eyes met, she quickly looked away, leaving him feeling the heavy weight of the tension between them. Seeing her today avoiding his gaze, smiling for everyone except him, was a punishment he had no choice but to endure. For Vian, being here wasn't easy either. The memory of Jungkook's anger and the heartbreak that followed was still fresh, even after months. Yet she pushed those feelings aside for Isha, who deserved nothing but happiness today. Vian vowed not to let her struggles show and focused on her best friend. Jimin, ever the cheerful one, walked up to the Isha with a mischievous smile, handing her a sleek white envelope. Happy birthday, kiddo, with a teasing smile. Oppa, what's this? Did you don't have a time to buy me a proper gift, or you just giving me money on my birthday? She pouted. Jimin chuckled, clearly enjoying her sulking. Don't judge too quickly, just open it and see. She tore open the envelope reluctantly, but her expression changed immediately as her eyes went wide in shock. She gasped, staring at the contents before exclaiming, No way, ticket of BTS concert. Oppa, how did you even get these? Jimin smirked, crossing his arms. You're welcome, it wasn't easy. Overwhelmed with joy, Isha hugged Jimin tightly, thanking him over and over. Thank you, Oppa. You have no idea how much this means to me. Vian couldn't help but smile at her friend's happiness, while Jungkook quietly observed the scene, his lips curling into a faint smile. Jimin shot him a thumbs up, and Vian caught the silent exchange. She realized that Jungkook must have been the one who gave the idea for the tickets, and despite her lingering pain, a part of her softened at the thought of how thoughtful Jungkook is when it comes to his family. Mrs. Yeon then called everyone over the cake cutting ceremony. Isha, full of excitement, grabbed Vine's hand and pulled her to stand beside her family. Vine's grandmother was already standing there, smiling warmly. It was a small but meaningful gesture, proof that Isha considered Vine more than a friend. Happy birthday, Isha, everyone chorused as she blew out the candles and cut the cake. She offered the first slice to her father, then her mother, and then to Jungkook. Finally, she turned to Vine and her grandmother. Vine blinked in surprise, but Isha grinned, handing the Vine a piece after giving her grandmother one as well. Thank you, my dear, she said warmly, placing a gentle hand on Isha's head. May you always be happy and blessed. The Jeon exchanged smiles, touched by the elder's blessing. Even Jungkook, despite his internal turmoil, felt a flicker of warmth. As the celebration carried on, Vine stood at the side observing everything with a bittersweet smile. Her eyes drifted to Jungkook, who seemed momentarily at ease, but that peace shattered when one of the bodyguards approached him, whispering something in his ear. Vine wasn't the only one who noticed. Jimin, standing nearby, saw a shift in Jungkook's expression. His earlier warmth was replaced by a cold, hardened look. Without a word, Jungkook excused himself, heading towards the exit. Jimin, sensing something was wrong, immediately followed. Mrs. Jeon noticed too, her smile faltering. What's happening? She asked her husband quietly. Mr. Jeon's face darkened. I'll check on it. Stay here. Mrs. Jeon nodded, her worry evident but understanding the unspoken weight of the situation. The birthday celebration had ended and the house grew quieter. Mrs. Jeon, Isha, Vine, and Vine's grandmother sat together in the living room, their earlier laughter replaced with unease. It had been hours since Jungkook, Mr. Jeon, and Jimin left, and no one had any idea where they went. The worry was evident on Mrs. Jeon's face, and even Isha, usually carefully, looked restless. Vine sat silently beside her grandmother, trying not to let her own concern show, but deep down the tension was eating her. When the door finally opened and Jimin walked in, all heads turned towards him. Mrs. Jeon wasted no time. Jimin, what happened? Where's Jungkook? What's going on? Jimin sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly tired but calm. He explained that police had come earlier not to arrest Jungkook but to ask for his help regarding to an old case from his school days. The mention of the police made everyone tense, especially Mrs. Jeon, who vividly remembered the last time they took Jungkook. Back then. He had been sent to a detention center over a false allegation that he had molested someone, a nightmare none of them wanted to relive. Jimin quickly assured them that this wasn't the same situation, though it connected. He explained that police reopened an old case involving a classmate of Jungkook's, a boy named Jongin, who had been accused of using and distributing illegal substances during their school days, and a charge of killing a student. Apparently, Jungkook had some evidence to support those claims, but before the case could progress, Jungkook himself had been falsely accused and sent to detention. Shortly before, Jongin was in a serious accident that left him in a coma, leading the case against him to be dismissed. Now, after 6 years, Jongin had woke up and someone had reopened the case. Mrs. Jeon and Isha exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Jeon asked quietly, but Jungkook had already served his punishment. Why is this coming up again? Is he in trouble? Jimin shook his head. No, he is not in trouble. The police just wanted information from him because it seems the two cases are somehow linked. Mr. Jeon stayed with Jungkook to make sure everything is handled properly. An action that even surprised Jimin because witnessing the cold relationship between Jungkook and his father from years was something he always knew. But after the hurtful talk in hospital, it seems that Mr. Jeon was really putting efforts this time. It was Mr. Jeon who told him to return back and tell everything to Mrs. Jeon, knowing that all must be worried, and he went with Jungkook to surprise. Jungkook didn't even deny his father's request. Though his expression eased some of their initial panic, the tension in the room didn't completely dissipate. Mr. Jeon's face was still clouded with worry, and Isha fidgeted nervously. Vine sat quietly, her thought racing. She had no idea about Jungkook's connection to this old case, but hearing the details, she felt a wave of concern she couldn't suppress. She knew how deeply the false accusation had scared Jungkook and how much he struggled to cope. Now this development could bring all those old wounds back to the surface. Despite her promise to stay out of Jungkook's life, Vine couldn't help but feel worried for him. She clenched her hands, reminding herself of his words, of how he wanted her to stay away. This wasn't her place to interfere, it never had been, but no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the worry refused to leave her heart. Outside the school entrance, Vine and Isha stood together, ready to leave after a long day. A chilly breeze passed by, making Vine pull her cardigan closer. Vine adjusted her bag and looked at Isha. I need to stop by the library to grab a few books for the notes I'm preparing. Do you want to come with me? Isha let out an exaggerated groan. I'm sorry, Vine, I'm so tired. If I go with you, I probably end up sleeping on off the tables. Vine chuckled, shaking her head. Alright then, you go home and rest. I'll go alone. But before Vine could take a step, Isha suddenly began unwrapping the scarf around her neck and tied it carefully around Vine instead. Vine blinked in surprise. Wait, this scarf? I know, she cut her off with a small smile. I love it and it's gorgeous, but it's cold outside. You're walking the library and I'm just heading straight home. I don't need it as much as you do. But this is your favorite scarf. Exactly, which is why I know you'll take care of it, she teased with a wink. Just give it back when you get home. Now go before the library closes. Vine hesitated, her hand brushing over the soft fabric. Thanks, Ish, you are too sweet sometimes. Of course I am, she grinned. Just then a boy from their class called out to Isha from the school gate. Hey Isha, I need to ask you something. Isha rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed. Now what this stupid wants from me, she muttered under her breath. Nonetheless, she turned to follow him. As she walked away, she glanced back briefly, knowing Vine would head straight to the library. With a shrug, she continued walking towards the boy. Vine started on her way. He screamed, his voice cracking as he struggled against their grip. I didn't do anything, you know I'm innocent, please tell them. But Mr. Jian stood motionless, his face cold and stoic. Not once did he look into Jungkook's direction. Jungkook's struggle grew frantic. Look at me, say something, you know I would. His voice broke again, swallowed by desperation. Behind him, Mrs. Jian cried helplessly, her trembling hands hovering near her lips. Please let him go, my son would never do this. She begged, her feet hesitant, as though an invisible barrier stopped her from running after him. At a staircase, a young Isha, just 12 years old, clutched the railing tightly. Her wide, innocent eyes started between brother and chaos unfolding. She didn't understand what was happening, but sensed the heaviness in the air. Amma, what's going on? Why are they taking Oppa? She asked, her voice trembling. Jungkook's scream continued, his pleas echoing in the house like a broken record. Yet his father's eye remained forward, not once meeting his son's desperate gaze. As the officers were dragging Jungkook out of the house, Mrs. Yeon turned to her husband, her tear unstoppable. Do something, you know he wouldn't hurt anyone, he is your son. But Mr. Jeon's face, though carved from eyes, betrayed a flicker of restrained emotion. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his voice was calm and firm. The police has all the evidence against him, so he has to face the consequences of his actions. Jungkook heard everything but was dragged outside into the cold night, turned his head one last time, any hope for his father to stop him destroyed, as the door closed behind him. The stark grey walls of the detention center closed in on Jungkook as a guard led him to his assigned cell. The air was suffocating, reeking of dampness and despair. Jungkook's eyes fell on the dingy cot and cracked walls, but he felt nothing. His emotions were locked away, replaced by a seething void of anger and betrayal. He sat on the edge of the cot, staring at his hands. His knuckles were raw from resisting, his mind replaying his father's cold words. He has to face the consequences of his actions. The anger started bubbling inside for his father. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. The other boys, much older and stronger than him, wasted no time asserting their dominance. They shoved coats into him, mocked him relentlessly, and jeered with cruel names. Every nasty words and injustice he faced continued to increase his anger, who turned into hate over the time for his father. At the sight, they would corner him, their feast doing the talking. Jungkook learned quickly to stay quiet, to endure. Even when he tried to fight back once, he was beaten so badly that he lay on the floor for hours, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, too broken to cry. But one day, one of the boys said something vile about Isha, his little sister who had nothing to do with any of this. Something inside Jungkook snapped. He launched at the boy, fist flying with a fury he didn't know he had. The boy nose bled, and Jungkook didn't stop until the guards pulled him away. But his rebellion earned him no relief. The guards punished all them, forcing them to clean the rooftop under the blazing sun. The punishment from the earlier had drained his energy, but he kept his head down, determined not to show the weakness. He scrubbed the rooftop silently, the other boys watching him with hatred in their eyes. When the guards left, they struck. A hand snatched the broom from his grip. He looked up to see the leader of the group of bullies, his face twisted in anger. "You think you have won now, huh? After making us get punished because of you." Jungkook straightened his fist, clenching at his sides. "I didn't make you punish, you did that to yourself." The bully sneered, shoving Jungkook backward. "Listen to this. Talk big, you are nothing but trash." The other boys circled Jungkook, closing like a vulture, but this time Jungkook didn't stay silent. He looked each one of them in the eye, his voice low but steady. "You are all cowards. You can only pick on someone when you are in a group." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the bullies seemed stunned. Then the leader's the face twisted in fury. "What did you just say?" Jungkook stood his ground. "You heard me, cowards, weaklings. You are too scared to face anyone alone, so you gang up on people to feel strong." The leader's head shot out, grabbing Jungkook by the collar. "If you think so highly of yourself, prove it." He spat, his voice dripping with venom. The group closed in tighter, and before Jungkook could react, they dragged him towards the large water tank at the edge of the rooftop. "Let's see how strong you are when no one can hear your scream," he sneered. Jungkook fought back, but the odds were against him. They shoved him into the tank, the cold metal walls closing in around him. He stumbled inside, hitting the bottom with a dull thud. Before he could climb out, the lid slammed shut above him. "Help!" he shouted, banging his fist against the metal. His voice echoed inside, but the tank outside, all he could hear was the muffled laughter of the boys. "Let's leave him there for a while," one of them said, their voice fading as they walked away. Jungkook's breathing grew rapid, the air inside the tank feeling thinner with each passing second. Panic clawed at his chest as he screamed again, his voice hoarse. "Somebody help!" The darkness pressed in, suffocating and unrelenting. His fist pounded against the lid until they ached, but no one came. His strength waned, and he slumped against the side of the tank, gasping for air. His vision blurred, and his body grew weak. Jungkook jolted awoke, his chest heaving as if he was still trapped in that tank. Cold sweat soaked his shirt, and his heart pounded like a drum. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the wetness of tear he hadn't realized he had shed. His breathing was raised, his body trembling. Reaching for the bottle of pills on his nightstand, he popped one into his mouth, swallowing it dry, but the pill did little to calm the storm raging inside him. His head throbbed as the weight of the nightmare pressed on him. The visit from the police had ripped open wounds he thought he'd buried long ago. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed his temple. The memories of his past were still vivid, making it harder to distinguish reality from the nightmare he just had woken from. The door creaked open, and Mrs. John stepped in, carrying a box. She was about to call his name, but the sight of Jungkook stopped her. Her heart sank seeing him like that, drenched in sweat, his face pale and his expression distant. "Jungkook," she called softly, walking towards him. She set the box aside and crouched in front of her, voice laced with worry. "What happened? Are you okay?" Jungkook blinked, his hazy eyes met hers. For a moment he wanted to tell her to let it all out, but the words wouldn't come. He forced a faint smile and shook his head. "It's nothing, Mama, just headache." Mrs. John felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words almost unbearable. She could see through his facade, the way he avoided her gaze, the way his hands clenched as if holding back something heavy. Her son was suffering, and no matter how much she wanted to help, he wouldn't let her in. Jungkook, she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch his face, her thumb brushing against his cheek. You are not okay. I can see it. Please talk to me. You don't have to go through this alone. Jungkook's throat tightened, and for a moment he let himself lean forward, wrapping his arms around her waist. I'm fine, Amma, he murmured, his voice barely audible, but in that embrace he sought the comfort he couldn't put into words, the warmth of one person who had never turned her back on him. Mrs. John instinctively placed her hand on his head, gently massaging it. She didn't push further, though her heart ached. She wanted so desperately to share his burden, to take away the pain that she could see consuming him, but she also knew he wasn't ready. He had built walls around himself, and no matter how much she tried, those walls remained. You have been through so much, she said softly, her fingers threading through his hairs. I wish I could make it all go away. Jungkook pulled back, meeting her gaze. He saw the worry in her eyes, silent plea for him to share what he was holding inside. He took her hand and kissed it gently. I'm really okay, Amma. Just forgot to take my medicine last night, that's all. Mrs. Yeon didn't believe him entirely, but she didn't push further. She simply kissed his cheek, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. All right, she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. Jungkook's eyes drifted to the box she had brought in. What's that? He asked, trying to change the subject. Mrs. Yeon glanced at it and smiled faintly. Someone left it for you earlier. I thought I'd bring it to your room. Before they could say more, a loud voice echoed through the house. Umma, I'm back and I'm starving. It was Isha. Her cheerful tone broke the heavy silence in the room, and Mrs. Yeon let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. That girl, she said fondly. She stood up, patting Jungkook's shoulder. Come downstairs and eat something, alright? Jungkook nodded silently, watching as his mother left the room. His attention was drifted to the box his mother had left. Staring at something about it felt off. He picked it up and turned it over, searching for a name, a sender, anything, but there was nothing. His brows furrowed as he noticed a folded letter attached to the top. He tore it open and began reading. The words sent a chill down his spine. His fingers trembled slightly as he quietly opened the box. His breath hissed and his heart dropped. Inside was a scarf he had gifted Isha on her birthday, now soaked in blood. Jungkook's expression morphed into one of pure horror. His blood ran cold, and for a moment his entire body froze. But then he heard Isha's voice from downstairs, her cheerful tone ringing through the house. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. Gripping the blooded scarf, he bolted out of his room, his voice echoing through the halls. He reached the living room in a few frantic steps, his eyes scanning the room. There she was sitting calmly at the dining table, happily eating her lunch. Mrs. John looked up, startled by his sudden outburst. What's wrong, Jungkook? Why are you shouting? He stood there, his chest heaving as his eye darted between Isha and the scarf in his hand. His mind raced. If Isha was safe and unharmed, then who sent this? Was it a threat to scare him? Isha noticed the scarf in his hand and frowned. Oppa, she said, pointing at it. Where did you get that? She blinked, remembering it should be with her bestie. I gave it to Ryan. Jungkook felt like the ground beneath him had collapsed. His mind screamed, piecing together the implication. If the scarf was with Ryan, and now it was there, laced in blood. His breathing grew shallow, his veins pounding like a drum in his head, his vision blurred with a mixture of panic and rage as he stumbled back a step. If something had happened to her because of him, he didn't think he could live with himself. Oppa, her voice was laced with worry now. What's going on? But Jungkook didn't answer. He turned on his heel and bolted towards the door without another word, his heart racing as if it would explode. Mrs. Yeon and Isha stared after him, fear gripping on them as they saw the pale, almost frantic expression on his face, consumed with the one thought. In a dimly lit office, a man leaned against his desk, a phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, gruff, and dripping with malice. It's done? Yes, sir. The voice on the other side and replied. The girl has been brought down just like you said, but she is still unconscious. The man's lips curled into a cold smirk. Wake her up, you stupid, and make her suffer. I want Jungkook to feel the same pain I have endured all these years. Make sure he knows what it feels like to see your close one suffering each day. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of hesitation, but the man wasn't to wait. Did you hear me? He snapped. Yes, sir. The other man stammered before the call disconnected. The man behind the desk placed the phone down with a deliberate motion, his jaw tightening as he stared out of the window. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice in his eyes. President Kang's face hardened, his mind flashing back to 6 years ago. His son Jongin Kang, his pride and joy, lay in coma, the world moving on without him. For years, he had fought to protect Jongin, to shield him from the consequences of his mistakes. It was Jungkook who had nearly ruined everything. That boy had dared to speak up, to point fingers at Jongin, claiming he was the one supplying illegal substance to other students. He even accused Jongin of killing a fellow student, a boy whose dad President Kang had successfully written off a tragic overdose. But Jungkook had seen too much, known too much. President Kang had been forced to act swiftly, framing the boy for a heinous crime he hadn't committed. The sexual assault charges has been enough to silence Jungkook and destroy his credibility. The detention center had taken care of the rest, breaking the boy in a way no one could imagine. It had been satisfying seeing Jungkook suffer, knowing his voice had been silenced. President Kang had thought it was over, that his son's future was secure. But now, as Jongin finally opened his eyes after 6 long years, the nightmare threatened to return. The family of the boy who had died had reopened the case. Someone was protecting them, someone powerful enough to defy his threats. And President Kang knew exactly who it was. Jungkook, he muttered under his breath, his hands balling into fist. The boy who had dared to challenge his son, the boy who had escaped his grasp once. His hatred burned deep, resonating with a vengeance. You think you can interfere in my son's life again? You think you can win this time? His voice was a venomous whisper dripping with malice. He exhaled slowly, his anger simmering beneath the surface. I'll destroy you before you even get the chance. Jungkook's car sped through the streets like a bullet, his grip on steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His chest heaved with every breath, his mind spiraling into chaos. Why shouldn't be involved in this? She has nothing to do with it. Nothing. The thought of her being dragged into his mess sent waves of rage and guilt crashing over him. His mind painted a horrible picture of what might have happened to her, and it felt like his entire body was on fire. If anything happens to her, he would burn down President Kang alive. She is innocent, he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling, his hands shook. Not with fear but with desperation so raw it threatened to consume him. If anything happened to her, Jimin seated next to him glanced his way but said nothing. The tension in the car was thick and even he could sense how close Jungkook was to breaking. They had traced a clue from CCTV footage to abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Jungkook hadn't wasted a single second. His men were already scattered across the city, searching every possible lead, but this place had to be one. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that she was here. As the car surged to a halt outside the warehouse, Jungkook was out of the door before it even came to a complete stop. His boots pounded against the ground as he charged towards the entrance, barking the order to his men. Kill anyone who gets in your way, search every room, every corner, find her. His voice echoed raw and hoarse from shouting. He kicked the warehouse door open, his guns drawn, and stormed inside. His men quickly followed, taking down the guard station near the entrance. Shots rang out, bodies fell, but Jungkook barely registered any of it. He shouted, his voice breaking as it bounced off the cold, empty walls. His heart felt like it was being ripped apart with every second that passed without finding her. Every door he kicked open and every empty room he saw only added to his anguish. This is my fault. She shouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for me. I should have kept her away from all of this. I should have. The sound of gunshots snapped him out of his thoughts. Jungkook turned sharply, seeing Jimin take down a man who had appeared behind him. Go, he urged, motioning towards the staircase at the far end of the room. I've got this. Jungkook didn't hesitate. He sprinted towards the stairs, his breathing heavy and uneven. His heart pounded in his ears. As he climbed, his mind racing. Wayne, please be okay. Please. On the second floor, more guards appeared, but Jungkook didn't slow down. His movements were swift and deadly, taking each one of them with precision. He couldn't afford to waste time. Finally, he reached the last door at the end of the hallway. He could feel it. She was there. He slammed his shoulder into the door, breaking it open. Inside, two men turned towards him. Weapons drawn, Jungkook didn't think, didn't hesitate. He charged forward, taking them down with same ferocity that had carried him this far. With the last man fell, Jungkook turned his eyes, scanning the room desperately. And then he saw her. His breath hissed, his entire body froze. He whispered, his voice barely audible. The sight of her made his heart drop. He couldn't fully process what he was seeing, but the world seemed to spin around him. His hands trembled at his side, and for a moment he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The room was silent except for his uneven breathing. His chest felt tight, his heart pounding in his ears as he took a shaky step forward. Jimin entered the room moments later, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. But Jungkook didn't hear him, didn't register his presence. All he could see was Wine, and in that moment the weight of his feeling for her, feeling he had fought so hard to suppress, hit him like a tidal wave. Without another word, he immediately moved closer, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on her, as tears which he was holding back now flowing freely. Then he held her in his arms, gently trying not to hurt her further.